Well, it's a great honor to be able to join this outstanding event organized by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Dr. Jake Gordon. I apologize for not being able to be here in person with you today, hence this recording. Professor Gordon asked me to talk about three things really. One, the significance of African American studies in 2023. What lessons come out of African American studies, and also how to imagine the impact of African American studies, especially as it intersects with oral history and other disciplines. So for me as a scholar, and I've been a university professor for over 20 years now, and I was originally trained at Duke University, where I earned my PhD. I started as a field researcher for an NEH-sponsored project called Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. And that project essentially asked us to reimagine African American history and American history from the subjective experiences and perspectives of African American elders who came of age in the Jim Crow South in roughly the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So it was an incredible learning experience. And I'll never forget my first day of grad school at Duke, going to my research assistant assignment and being handed a page that had names on it and phone numbers. So a big part of my work as a graduate research assistant for the Behind the Veil Oral History Project was to do research on the field sites where African American elders lived, the communities, the main institutions that sustained people through the long years of Jim Crow American apartheid. And it was an eye-opening experience for a younger graduate student. And I parlayed that experience into a number of books, including my first monograph, Emancipation Betrayed. And it's important to understand, especially in the field of history, the kinds of unique contributions that African American studies has made. And so if you look at African American studies as a discipline, oral history is a very important part of African American studies. Orality, oral traditions, storytelling, memory, remembrances. And this discipline, African American studies, encompasses a lot of different perspectives, right? A lot of different methodologies. And I wanted to talk mainly about oral history because the experience that I had in interviewing African American elders in the 1990s is an experience that I have passed down to my graduate and undergraduate students today. Oral history has changed the way we think about slavery. It has changed the way we think about Reconstruction. It has certainly changed the way we think about the civil rights movement. Having the firsthand experiences of formerly enslaved African Americans as they were interviewed in the early 20th century. And by the way, we're still recovering those oral history interviews. We have many of them at the Library of Congress, but there's more work to be done. Being able to talk directly to organizers from, say, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or the Congress of Racial Equality or the Rainbow Coalition or labor unions has been invaluable in improving and enhancing our understanding of American history and the history of the African diaspora. And so that's why I'm emphasizing oral history as a critical component of Black studies. We could easily do the same thing with literature. When we think of the great writers, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, we could easily do the same thing with geography. When we think of people like Clyde Woods or founders of Black studies like Cedric Robinson, Sylvia Wynter, Angela Davis, and so many others. What are some of the lessons learned in African American studies? Well, one of the lessons is that we need African American studies to help us understand the world we live in today. Why is the state of Florida trying to ban and censor Black Studies curriculum? What is the energy behind that? What is the impetus behind that? We live in a moment when Black Studies is literally under siege. But as we talked about last week, and I wanted to share with you that last week, hundreds of students from the University of Florida walked out of their classes. Thousands of students, high school students and college students across the state walked out of their classes and protested on behalf of African American studies. Now think about that for a minute. As a professor, I'm so thrilled when I learn that students are actually protesting for the right to learn more. They were protesting for the right to read Kimberly Crenshaw. The students were protesting for the right to read Roderick Ferguson. They were protesting for the right to read Robin D.G. Kelley. All of those great Black Studies authors have been banned by the state of Florida and other states as well, and their names purged from the advanced placement African American Studies curriculum. That's a shame, but it's a reminder that African American Studies and really also African American history have been under siege and have been contested from the very beginning. African American Studies is important for so many reasons, and one of the reasons is that it's one of our disciplines that comes about not because of people like me, but because of people like you, because of people like us. It's the students, the staff, and the faculty and communities that come together in places like San Francisco, California, Buffalo, New York, Syracuse, Columbus, Gainesville, Florida, so many different places in the late 60s and early 70s. And again, the image of students protesting for the right to establish an academic discipline. This is part of what makes African American Studies unique, but also connected to other comparative race and ethnic studies and gender studies projects. Because women's studies, gender studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies, Latinx studies, the list goes on, all of these come about because of mass movements, protests, and especially led by first-generation college students. And why that's important is that it's really first-generation college students, even to this day, who demand of our educational institutions a sense of relevance. Where are my people's histories in the broader scheme of things? Where are my people's narratives, poetry, music, culture? Where are they to be found within the curriculum of K through 20 education? This is one of the great contributions of African American Studies. It can answer many of those questions, or it can help us pose even better questions. But the fact that first-generation college students were instrumental in establishing African American Studies is essentially the key to understanding its continuing importance. African American Studies puts college and university campuses in direct contact with broader supporting communities. And it therefore is a form of dialogical knowledge. What I mean by this is that African American Studies isn't just me as a professor and affiliate faculty member of African American Studies at UF going out into Gainesville or to Los Angeles or to the South Bronx and telling people what Black Studies is. It's reciprocal. It's me going to the South Bronx or to East Los Angeles or to Gainesville, Florida, and learning from the community their interpretations, their understanding of Black Studies. And in the case of me being a historian, of course, I'm most interested in the history of communities. But if I was a literary scholar, if I was an ethnographer, if I was a sociologist, you kind of get my drift by now. We have many different, there are many different disciplines within Black Studies. In terms of reimagining the impact of African American Studies, I want to close by, again, reminding us that all over this country, high school students, college students, labor union members, church, synagogue, mosque members are stepping up and holding history workshops, history seminars. And my Black History Month and my Hispanic Heritage Month especially, because I teach both of those wonderful topics, it grew exponentially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement resurgence in the spring of 2020. And I want to close on this note because I want us to remember the connectivity, the connections between African American studies and the broader popular movement. This is what the founders of our field, again, people like Sylvia Wynter, C.L.R. James, Carter G. Woodson, and others stressed that you can't just have African American studies on the campus or in the classroom or in the library. African American studies is everywhere. It is in public murals. It's in graffiti. It's in breakdancing. It's in spoken word. And in other words, we don't hide our light under a bushel, to borrow an old biblical metaphor. We go out into communities and we work in communities. I remember having the great privilege to sit down and talk to Cedric Robinson and Carlos Munoz at different points, and I would ask them, you know, to you, what is Black Studies? What I asked Cedric Robinson, and to Carlos Munoz, you know, what was Chicano Studies originally? What were these incredible fields in their original iterations? And both of them essentially told me the same thing. They said, you weren't doing Black Studies in the 60s unless you took it to the prisons, unless you took it to the women's shelters, unless you took it to the labor union halls. In other words, it wasn't good enough to just do Black Studies or Latinx studies or Chicano studies in the classroom or in the library or in the seminar room. And so I guess I'll conclude on that note to remind us that when the Black Studies Matter, or when the Black Lives Matter movement really resurged in the spring of 2020, it had a tremendous positive impact on this nation's sense of needing to look in the mirror and learning our true history and learning our true relationships to each other. Again, I wish I could be there with you today. I apologize having to be out of town. But again, thank you to Professor Gordon for organizing the panel, and thank you for your invitation. It's been great.